Welcome to Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance, Black Modernism, Culture, Capitalism, and Double Consciousness. Before we talk about timelines, causes, or decline, we need to answer a foundational question. What was the Harlem Renaissance really? Well, the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural, intellectual, and political movement that emerged in the early 20th century, centered in Harlem, New York. It included literature, music, visual art, theater, and performance. But it was never just about art. It was about identity, representation, and power. Black art flourished. You see poets, novelists, musicians, visual artists, and critics. Figures like Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington emerged, whose cultural influence still shapes African American culture today. There are novels and poems, jazz and blues, nightclubs and salons, magazines, manifestos, and public debates about what Black art should be. While Black artists and intellectuals have long since been taken seriously by Black communities, presses, and institutions, the Harlem Renaissance marked the first time where this work entered the mainstream publishing, commercial artist markets, and public cultural discourse at national scale. Out of this movement emerged the idea of the new Negro, confident, visible, cultivated, and modern. And more importantly, it didn't just include Black people or traditional Black norms. Langston Hughes described the Harlem nightlife in his autobiography, The Big C. And he says, "What a crowd, all classes and colors met face to face, ultra aristocrats, bourgeoisie, communists, Park Avenue galore, bookers, publishers, Broadway celebs, and Harlem Nights giving each other the once over." This moment was never simple. The Harlem Renaissance did not exist in a vacuum. Much of the work produced during this period was not primarily consumed by the communities it came from. Exploitation remained a harsh reality, even for educated Black artists. Access was shaped by class, colorism, and respectability. Queer artists existed, sometimes openly and sometimes quietly, and not all Black people in Harlem experienced this Renaissance in the same way. Years later, in his memoir, The Big C, in the chapter When the Negro was in Vogue, Langston Hughes offered a sobering assessment. The ordinary Negroes hadn't heard of the Negro Renaissance, and if they had, it hadn't raised their wages any. That observation captures the central contradiction of the Harlem Renaissance. The art was beautiful, provocative, healing. It shifted culture and visibility, but the cultural recognition alone did not dismantle economic inequality or political exclusion like many had hoped. At its core, the Harlem Renaissance asks a powerful question. Could culture change how Black people were treated in America? For a time, many believed the answer was yes, but in practice, the reality was more sobering. For a few, it was opportunity. For many, it was performance. The Harlem Renaissance was not a fairy tale. It was not a pure victory, and it was not a single story. It was messy, ambitious, contradictory, and ultimately unfinished. Today, we reframe the Harlem Renaissance as more than an artistic movement. It was a cultural, political, and economic response to segregation, migration, and exclusion. Art created visibility, but visibility did not guarantee freedom. Over the next lectures, we'll unpack this movement fully, the timelines, the money, the ideologies, the identities, and the aftermath. Until then, sit with and leave your answer to our reflection question in the comments. We know now that cultural recognition doesn't automatically produce material change. However, what do you think people hope the Harlem Renaissance would actually accomplish during its infancy? Tomorrow, we'll begin situating the Harlem Renaissance in time and acts. How did this movement evolve? And why do so many people misunderstand when it actually happened? Before we go deeper into individual figures and political debates, we need to talk about time. Not just dates, but phases. Much of the confusion surrounding the Harlem Renaissance, especially the viral claim the Great Depression was happening at the same time as the Harlem Renaissance, comes from the flattening of the timeline. This statement is technically true, but historically incomplete. The Harlem Renaissance did not look, function, or believe the same things from beginning to end. Following the Great Migration, which we'll cover in Lecture 3, Harlem becomes a dense center of Black life, where writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals live in close proximity, exchanging ideas and experimenting with form. For some, it's also a period of relative prosperity, and it shapes the culture just as it does across America. The early Harlem Renaissance is marked by extravagant house parties and literary salons, thriving nightlife and entertainment venues, patron funding publications and prizes, and artists being able to live middle-class lifestyles. This phase is not just about creativity, it's about visibility, consumption, and display. We see Black elites performing modernity and refinement. In The New Negro, Alan Locke frames Black art as cultivated and globally significant, positioning cultural achievement as evidence of racial progress and sophistication. Importantly, much of the work most commonly associated with the Harlem Renaissance is produced pre-1925, including The Weary Blues, Color, and Passing, which was published right before the economic crash. At its core, this phase of the movement is centered on a belief that cultural excellence could produce racial progress. In 1929, the Great Depression begins, and with it, the illusion of permanence collapses. This does not immediately end the Harlem Renaissance, but it does reshape it. Funding dries up, patronage becomes more conditional, and opportunities narrow. Many artists are forced to seek stability through federal programs and institutional support. As material conditions change, beliefs change. The art and writing of this period increasingly interrogates labor, critiques American democracy, and questions whether culture alone can produce freedom. This internal reckoning is captured vividly within Infants of the Spring, a satirical novel written from within Harlem's artistic circles. Rather than celebrating the movement, Thurman exposes its fractures. Artists struggling financially, dependence on white patrons, ideological infighting, and the growing realization that cultural success had not produced material security. Infants of the Spring marks a shift from confidence to critique. The guiding question changes from how do we prove our humanity to why does the system require us to prove it at all? This is no longer a cultural movement pretending that politics is optional. There is no celebratory ending to the Harlem Renaissance. What we see instead is dispersal. Artists leaving Harlem for work elsewhere, institutions losing funding, and cultural energy shifting towards labor movement, New Deal programs, and direct political organizing. By the mid-1930s, the Harlem Renaissance dissolves as a cohesive cultural movement. Many participants later described the Harlem Renaissance as incomplete. In the Big C, in the chapter When the Negro Was in Vogue, Langston Hughes criticizes the movement for its dependence on white patronage and its distance from the black working class. The Harlem Renaissance did not end because black people in Harlem stopped creating. It ended because the systems that supported it stopped. There was no single moment when it ended. It just could no longer exist in the way that it once had. Today, we unpacked how the Harlem Renaissance unfolded in phases: formation, visibility, fracture, and then dispersal. Including the Great Depression shows that the movement did not end suddenly. It contracted as the conditions sustaining it collapsed. So before our next lecture, sit with and leave the answer to this reflection question in the comments below. Why do you think history prefers to freeze the Harlem Renaissance in its most glamorous years rather than teaching its decline and critique? Next, we move backward to see how Harlem became black in the first place and why geography mattered so much. By the 1920s, Harlem had become a symbolic center for black modernism. But how does Harlem go from being 33% black in 1920 to 70% black by 1930 and become a global cultural capital along the way? To answer that, we need to step back and look at how Harlem became black in the first place and why it became the black mecca. At the turn of the 20th century, Harlem was a white working to middle class neighborhood built as a suburban extension of Manhattan and filled with newly constructed apartment buildings. Developers overbuilt, demand never fully materialized, and then the real estate market collapsed. White landlords were left with vacant buildings and mounting debt. At the same time, black New Yorkers crowded into segregated downtown neighborhoods and increasingly priced out of lower Manhattan were searching for housing. Black real estate brokers and entrepreneurs like Philip Payton seized the opportunity, and profit-driven landlords began renting the black tenants. As black residents moved in, white residents moved out. This shift happened quickly. From 1910 to 1930, Harlem's black population increased from 90,000 to 300,000. A massive neighborhood, roughly 128th to 155th Street, 8th Avenue to Park Avenue, became a black metropolis. Black New Yorkers did not choose Harlem from unlimited options. They were blocked from living across most of the city. Across New York, restrictive covenants, informal segregation, landlord discrimination, and neighborhood violence against black residents kept black people out of many neighborhoods. These practices limited where black people could live regardless of income. Harlem became one of the few neighborhoods where black tenants could rent at scale. This is crucial to understand. Harlem was prime Manhattan real estate, connected by subway, close to the nation's largest publishing houses, near nationally renowned theaters, clubs, and media institutions, and firmly inside of Manhattan's cultural economy. Black residents were physically close to power, even when excluded from it. Black artists could move between their community and the publishing world. Harlem had visibility. In later decades, the opening of the A train and wartime industrial jobs would draw black residents to Brooklyn neighborhoods like Fort Greene and Bed-Stuy. But in the 1920s, Harlem was the place to be, baby. Overlay this housing shift with the Great Migration. Beginning in the 1910s, millions of black Americans left the South pushed by racial terror and lynching, sharecropping, and debt peonage, and political disenfranchisement. They were pulled northward by industrial jobs, wartime labor shortages, and the promise, though not the guarantee, of greater autonomy. As New York became a major destination, Harlem absorbed its growing black population. People moved there because black communities that could provide support were already established in Harlem. That density produced the Harlem Renaissance, not a creative accident, but the result of people, space, and resources colliding. Harlem became a place where writers lived near other writers, musicians near musicians, and editors, performers, thinkers, and organizers shared the same streets. As Harlem was forming, black communities across the country were also experiencing economical, cultural, and political transformation. During this time period, black newspapers flourished, black-owned businesses expanded, churches and mutual aid societies grew in power, and labor organizing and political consciousness increased. There were other black cultural and economic centers: Chicago, DC, Detroit. And in some places, black people built entire self-sustaining communities. One of the most well-known examples is the Greenwood District, often called Black Wall Street, a thriving black business district that was violently destroyed in 1921. Each were a part of a broader movement towards black self-determination. Like Harlem, after the 1920s, each of these centers eventually experienced shifts in politics, production, and priorities as economies and political pressures intensified. So why is Harlem the movement we remember? Part of the answer is geography, media concentration, proximity to publishers, and access to national and largely white audiences. Harlem's culture circulated widely through magazines, books, music, and performance, making it the most commercialized black cultural center of its era. Its artists became mainstream, visible, viable, and marketable. Harlem wasn't the only site of black innovation. It was the most easily commercialized. Today we unpacked how a cultural mecca came to be. Harlem became black not by accident, but through segregation, real estate collapse, and migration. Concentration, not creativity alone, made the Harlem Renaissance possible. Before our next lecture, sit with and leave your answers to the reflection question in the comments. How does understanding Harlem as a product of restriction, not free choice, change how we think about cultural centers and the creation of culture? Next lecture, we ground ourselves in daily life and ask what was living in Harlem really like during the Harlem Renaissance. And we're at the end of our first unit. Week 1 was focused on conditions, context, and daily life. So far, we've talked about what the Harlem Renaissance was, when it happened, and how Harlem became black. But before we move into the leaders, ideology, and the art, we need to slow down and ground ourselves in a fundamental question. What did everyday life in Harlem look like for most black people during the Harlem Renaissance? Because culture didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged under pressure alongside violence, poverty, and surveillance. Harlem became a major organizing hub for black political and cultural institutions, including the NAACP and Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was a center of leadership, publishing, mass meetings, and political mobilization. But most black Harlemites were not activists, artists with patrons, or writers with publishers. They were domestic workers, porters and laborers, recent southern migrants, and families navigating segregation in a northern city. The timing matters. The Harlem Renaissance unfolded during one of the most violent periods of U.S. race relations after Reconstruction. The Red Summer of 1919 and the NYC race riots of 1900, widespread lynching and race riots, black veterans returning from World War I demanding democracy at home, and intensifying white backlash nationwide. Harlem did not exist outside of this climate. It existed within it, and many Harlem Renaissance artists wrote directly about this violence. As Harlem's black population surged during the Great Migration, housing did not expand to meet demand. Apartments were subdivided, rents were inflated, and overcrowding became the norm. Redlining and segregation meant Harlem wasn't just where poor black residents lived. It's where black people were allowed to live in Manhattan. Even black professionals who could afford to live elsewhere were often confined to Harlem, though some could afford more desirable blocks within it. The result was a compressed city, wealth and poverty living side by side. Class differences expressed block by block, not neighborhood by neighborhood. Most Harlem residents were poor to working class. Even as cultural energy surged, economic insecurity remained, producing multiple Harlems at once. One of the biggest mistakes we make when discussing the Harlem Renaissance is imagining Harlem as one unified community. It wasn't. Harlem was large and expansive and deeply stratified. As Harlem's black population grew, the neighborhood expanded in every direction. South towards 128th Street, east towards Park Avenue, west of 8th Avenue, and north towards 160th Street. And where you lived shaped what kind of black life you could actually live. At the core was Central Harlem, roughly stretching from 130th to 144th Streets, 5th Avenue to 8th Avenue. This is where the largest number of black migrants settled. This Harlem was overcrowded, working class, full of recent southern migrants, and shaped by rent inflation and subdivided apartments. This is where most black Harlemites actually lived. Not artists with patrons, but families trying to make it work. The Harlem Renaissance was happening here, quietly, mostly in sound, rumor, and aspiration. Just a few blocks away was Shriver's Row. On 138th and 139th Streets between 7th and 8th Avenues, this was where Harlem's black professional class lived. Doctors, dentists, lawyers, and educators. Shriver's Row wasn't just housing. It was a signal. It represented what success was supposed to look like. The Harlem that organizations like the NAACP want America to see. Educated, refined, orderly, and respectable. By the late 1920s, wealthier black residents moved north toward Sugar Hill, particularly among Edgecombe Avenue, roughly between 145th and 155th Streets. Sugar Hill meant larger apartments, more privacy, distance between overcrowding, and insulation from police scrutiny. This was Harlem's elite tier, literally elevated, nestled above Central Harlem, putting physical distance between residents and its risks. Distance from poverty created distance from scrutiny. Running through all of this was Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue, Harlem's commercial and entertainment arteries. This is where clubs flourished, businesses thrived, nightlife attracted white tourists, and artists could sometimes make real money. But prosperity was uneven. Money flowed through these avenues mostly out to the white landlords, club owners, and publishers, and not back into the residents' pockets. Visibility did not equal ownership. Where you lived also shaped how closely you were policed. Respectable blocks were monitored differently than overcrowded ones. Prohibition transformed Harlem into a nightlife destination. Speakeasies, rent parties, and jazz clubs flourished. Black queer life became unusually visible, and that visibility came with heavy policing. Prohibition gave police cover to raid clubs, target queer spaces, and arrest residents under vague morality laws. White visitors could consume Harlem's culture and leave. Black residents stayed behind to absorb the raids, fines, and instability. When Prohibition ended in 1933, much of that white nightlife tourism disappeared. Harlem was left with fewer external dollars, the same policing, and deeper economic vulnerability. After 1929, black unemployment reached 40 to 50% nationally, double the national average. Disposable income collapsed. Rent parties became survival strategies, not just entertainment. And clubs closed, publishers folded, and jobs vanished. This is when the Harlem Renaissance contracts economically, even as its cultural legacy grows. Two Harlems existed at once: Harlem as a spectacle and Harlem as a lived reality. White audiences experienced novelty and controlled transgression. Black residents experienced surveillance, poverty, and instability. Joy existed, but inside struggle, not separate from it. The Harlem Renaissance cannot be understood by famous names alone. It was created amid social violence, under police scrutiny, and during economic collapse. This is the environment that shaped every artist we'll study. When we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, we're really discussing multiple Harlems happening at once. Harlem as a spectacle for white audiences, Harlem as survival for working class residences, Harlem as aspiration for black elites, Harlem as extraction for institutions. Block by block, access changed. Street by street, opportunity narrowed or widened. The Renaissance didn't just reflect inequality. It was built on top of it. Before we move into the next unit, let's pause. In week one, we established the following. The Harlem Renaissance was never just about art. It was a cultural and political project shaped by power, money, and identity. Its timeline was not flat. The movement rose, fractured, and transformed. It was never a single golden age. Harlem became black through structure, not coincidence. Segregation, real estate collapse, and migration created density. And that concentration made the Harlem Renaissance possible. Life inside Harlem was uneven, and where you lived shaped what you could access and how you were policed. Before the next lecture, sit with this and leave your answer to the reflection question in the comments below. When segregation forced black people from different regions, classes, and backgrounds into the same urban space, how did proximity reshape black cultural identity, and which identities became dominant, visible, or normalized? Next week, we'll turn to the leadership, ideology, and economics of the Harlem Renaissance, and ask who was shaping black creativity and modernity, and on whose terms. See you next lecture. Welcome to Ray University, the Harlem Renaissance Office Hours Edition. By the end of this class, if you're a STAR student, you probably realize that the responses to your reflection questions should have enough meat on its bones to help you solve our capstone question, which is, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance succeed and fail as a strategy for black freedom? At the end of the session, you should have responses to every Unit 1 reflection question, and more importantly, the foundation for your capstone essay. Some of you may have not written an essay in quite a while, and that's okay. That's why we're at office hours. I'm hoping that my answers to my reflection questions will help you think through your questions, organize your ideas, and start shaping an argument, and not to intimidate you, because I know this is pretty meaty. The course introduction question was, what do you first think of when you hear the Harlem Renaissance? And this question was really meant to prime your thinking, because studying history really does require an open mind. My answer was, I think of my second grade Black History Month writing assignment. I had to write an essay on a black historical figure, and I chose Duke Ellington. It was my first paper I ever researched on the internet. I remember using the class laptops, reading my first Wikipedia page, and learning what copy and paste was, and shortly after learning what plagiarism was. Once I realized I couldn't just copy and paste, I had to actually research. I had to check my resources, notice when two things said different things, and ask my teacher why. That assignment was my first lesson in questioning, interpreting, and reading in between the lines when creating and learning history. Lecture 1 was, we now know that cultural recognition doesn't automatically produce material change. What do you think people hoped the Harlem Renaissance would accomplish in its early years? This question was really to make you put yourself in these people's shoes, because I think that that's what's required to actually understand history. And my answer was, I honestly thought the Harlem Renaissance was mostly about joy. I imagined the roaring 20s, people having fun, being rebellious, celebrating black excellence and life after the war. The good times were rolling, and black people wanted to be a part of it. I thought they were just like anyone else, trying to make their mark on the world. Lecture 2. Why do you think history prefers to freeze the Harlem Renaissance in its most glamorous years rather than teaching its decline and critique? I think really the rest of these questions are to really begin interrogating and deconstructing what we're going to learn. And so my answer was, I think it's because the full story complicates things. It's easier to teach outcomes rather than consequences. When the Harlem Renaissance is framed as a brief golden age, it becomes a story of inspiration for black people and a story of exceptionalism that black people should aspire to for everyone else. Freezing the movement and glamour avoids confronting what it became after. Lecture 3. How does understanding Harlem as a product of restriction, not free choice, change how we think about culture cultural censors and the creation of culture? My answer was understanding Harlem as a product of restriction forces us to rethink cultural censors as something organic or voluntary. Harlem didn't become a cultural hub because everyone chose it. It became one because segregation and redlining left Black people with few other options. Culture emerged from proximity, pressure, and shared survival, not from freedom. That reframes cultural brilliance as something created under constraint, not ideal conditions. And the last question was, when segregation forced Black people from different regions, classes, and backgrounds into the same urban space, how did proximity reshape Black cultural identity? And which identities became dominant, visible, or normalized? My answer was, forced proximity created a shared Black culture, but not an equal one. Identities closest to respectability, education, light skin, and institutional access became more visible and treated as representative. Working class, Southern, queer, and poor identities were present but often marginalized. Harlem unified Black life and stratified it at the same time. As you craft your own responses, I want you to remember that these are not individual assignments. Together, they form the scaffolding for your capstone argument. And your job and your essay for your capstone argument is to connect these ideas, use the examples from the lectures, and argue to what extent the Harlem Renaissance succeeded and where it fell short. I'll see you next week.